I think that a good way is looking around the room, and if it's warm in there, I learned this from Quincy Jones. If the heads are bobbing and it's warm in the room, that's when you cut it off. You're like, this is it. Bounce it, Liz. You know what I mean?
Nice.
That's what I try and do.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Van Hunt, a Grammy-awarded musician, producer, songwriter, and recording artist originally from Dayton, Ohio, but now living in Los Angeles. His writing and production has been featured on recordings by such diverse artists as Dionne Farris, Rahsaan Patterson, and Cree Summer, as well as the platinum-selling soundtrack Love Jones. And he has released 5 of his own records over the past 15 years, also touring along such diverse acts as Kanye West, The Roots, Coldplay, Mary J. Blige, and Dave Matthews Band. Van draws his inspiration from a wide variety of musical influences. His last record, The Fun Rises, The Fun Sets, draws inspiration from the Delphonics, Parliament Funkadelic, Pink Floyd, and Billie Holiday, and was praised by the Boston Globe for bringing together a fusion of original funk and old soul. Van achieves, quote, the kind of heated raw sound that has virtually disappeared in too much of today's overly manicured R&B, never losing sight of the past as he progressively forges his own way forward, end quote. I've had the pleasure of working with Van in the studio, and I know from experience that Van has an open-minded sense of creativity and a true producer's skill of making everyone in the studio feel welcome and included in the process of creating something new and valuable. He's constantly surprised me with each new brilliant musical decision, and I'm sure he's going to surprise us on this interview too. Please welcome Van Hunt to Recording Studio Rockstars. Van, my man, are you ready to rock, dude?
Yeah, man. That was such a great introduction. I was waiting for the applause. It never came.
There it is, man. I have to applaud myself. We haven't figured out that part, how to have everybody actually here live while we do this. That would be pretty cool, though, you know?
You mean the people you interview or the audience?
Yeah, like an in-studio audience for a podcast, you know? I mean, we were talking about before this, we were chatting about 70s television shows, and they sort of introduced, well, I guess in-studio audience came before the 70s, but it was definitely a big part of TV, right?
Yeah, I would say so. And it probably remains a big part of the live show, even for musicians.
Yeah. Well, so Van, I did my long-winded introduction of you. Tell us more about who you are and how you got from, did I get it right, Dayton, Ohio to LA?
You did, man. I mean, you skipped over a couple places in between there, but rightfully so. So,
yeah, there was that 2-year stint. That 2-year stint you lived on the moon. Sorry, I forgot to mention that.
Yeah, you know, most people probably skip over Arlington, Texas, and Atlanta, Georgia. So.
Right on, man. Well, tell us more about who you are. How'd you get into this music thing? Sometimes I like to put a twist on it and ask our guests, what did starting out in recording smell like to you?
I like that. You know, I probably need to stop looking at this skadoodle. What is this, skadoosh picture?
Oh, yeah.
That's bringing.
You're still looking at my record. Yeah, Rockstars. Before we started, I was turning Van on to my record, Skadoosh, which you can find at skadooshmusic.com. If you can type it in. Van was having a little bit of trouble typing it in, but I know you can do it, Rockstars. Yeah, so Van, you started out in Dayton. How long were you there? Were you making music in Dayton, or was that like later on when you started moving around?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was making music like any other 7-8-year-old who was interested in making sounds. You know what I mean? I was beating on tables and kicking chairs and stomping on floors, you know, just singing along with the radio, things like that. But I left there when I was 10. But, you know, Dayton is really where most of the things I would describe as influences, that's where they inhabited. You my body,
Yeah.
like Parliament Funkadelic, and even some of the funk groups from Dayton, like Ohio Players and Slave. So I was kind of indoctrinated with all of that.
You know that Guided by Voices, I think they're from Dayton, Ohio as well.
Yeah, and it's so funny because one of my reviews of 2011 record I did, they compared me to Guided by Voices without making the association. We were both from Dayton, and then but they compared us both to what is it? That group, Hildegraph Generator. I'm saying that name all wrong.
Well, I know the actual scientific object, the what is it, the Hildegraph generator or whatever, but I'm not sure.
There's an actual group called that. Yeah, and so
isn't that the thing that like throws electric sparks off the top and makes lightning?
Well, clearly neither of us are scientists, so.
So do tell us though, what did starting out in recording smell like to you? What do you remember about your first recording experiences?
Man, I love that question because I think I described this to myself or in my notes the other day, and it wasn't just a smell, but like the smell was like old carpet, rust, and like wood. Mm-hmm. I don't know if rust has a smell, but certainly things that cause rust
when it's flying off the tape, right?
Yeah, that's kind of what I remember it smelling like and what it felt like, at least in my mind. And maybe that's romanticized a bit, but that's what it seemed like.
Well, it's kind of interesting.
That's what I see and smell.
I never thought about that, but up in Dayton, Ohio, you're up there in the Rust Belt, right? And rust and iron oxide particles is what makes up tape for recording music. So it kind of makes sense that Motown would come out of that part of the world as well.
Yeah, exactly. And all the metal from the trains, from the steel, the cars, all of that kind of flows into the sound.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about that. But what about the rhythm? I mean, do you feel like there's sort of an urban sound that helps create funk?
I think that it's an urban lifestyle that creates the funk. It's kind of a struggle, and then there's the reaction to the struggle. Mm-hmm. And obviously from that interaction, with all of these different kinds of people coming together to attack and immerse themselves into this struggle, the interaction stirs up a lot of different things. And it's kind of, a lot of people don't understand the closeness between what you might call blues, rock and roll, funk, punk. Those things kind of come out of the same brew, if you will. But they find their distinction in little things, like just the fact that I come from an African-American household might just slightly curb the same experience that someone from a European-American household might have had, and even though we come from the same environment.
Yeah. Well, definitely when I think of those things you described, all those musical styles, I think of electrified music too. It's sort of distinctively or inherently urban that an electrified band is coming from that environment, as opposed to maybe some of the banjos and fiddles up in the hills down here in Tennessee,
but which are no less rhythmic.
Yeah, totally.
Particularly when you start talking about like Appalachian kind of sounds, that start with an African banjo, and move on from there. And they start their little skip dance, that starts from the middle of your body. That's completely African. Even though it's in the middle of Kentucky, Tennessee.
Yeah, and the origination of blues is an acoustic guitar, finger picking on an acoustic guitar. Mm-hmm. The Southern Delta. All right, well, we digress a little bit, but talk a little bit more about your migration to Los Angeles and your recording journey.
Oh, well, so I left Ohio, I moved to Texas with my mom, so I'm still a 10-year-old at this point, and finished school in Texas. And then I during those 7 to 8 years before I went to college, I decided music was what I wanted to do. But my mother talked me into going, at least trying college, and I didn't really see the point, but I said, okay. So I went to college in Georgia, in Atlanta. and spent a year there basically trying to figure out the best way to get out of that arrangement. And I found that by flunking out of college. So I left college, and my mother was satisfied that she didn't want to waste any more money on me trying to be in college. So and then I started making demos for hip hop rappers and R&B singers. Terrible demos, but it was a good kind of learning environment for me. First attempts at making recordings, and really my first attempt at even trying to man instruments, because before that, as much as I loved music, it was really from a kind of a rhythmic standpoint that I even understood it, less so chordally or certainly, overall music theory. I didn't understand any at all, really. Mm-hmm. But intuitively, I got it. And so I started there and branched out from there and started making connections, networking. And
you're down in Atlanta at this point?
Yeah, I'm in Atlanta at this point. And I taught myself to play guitar, taught myself to play piano, drums, and finally got a chance to be in a band for an artist who had a record deal with Columbia Records. Her name was Dionne Farris. And she came and saw my band rehearse, and she was like, well, your band's terrible, but I'll put you in my band. And I was like, okay, that works. So I left everything, went on tour with her. It was a great sort of year and a half that we were on the road and becoming friends with not just she and I, but her band, the rest of her band. We all sort of built relationships that still last to this day. And from that, the person who signed her to Columbia Records happened to be this guy, Randy Jackson. And I gave him a bunch of my songs at that time. And he was like, man, these songs are good. We should talk. And he wound up using one of those songs for Dionne to record. And that was in the Love Jones movie that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. And
that song actually was the first song of mine that was ever published and ever, was on the radio, and actually came out. It was released on my birthday, March 8th, 1997, I believe.
Cool.
And man, from there, I was on and popping. I was at least making a living doing what I love to do, and I was still learning. Randy, became one of my biggest mentors in the business.
Well, it's cool. And I like hearing the story about how you found this thing that you like to do. You just started doing it. You just started recording. And it's also interesting always to hear the story about how important an influence can be. So somebody who comes along and identifies you and kind of tapped you, come with me, we're going to go travel and play music, just opens up a giant world of opportunity for you.
Yeah, exactly. And one that you have to be prepared on some level to take advantage of those opportunities. But, sometimes, you can just kind of stumble into an opportunity by just asking a few questions. And I certainly did a little bit of both, trying to be prepared myself, but also being open to walking into something that I wasn't prepared for, but it's an opportunity nonetheless.
Right. So you were making demos on, a 4-track tape recorder or something like that at the time?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I still do.
Nice, man. And had you spent any time in a professional studio too, or were you really just kind of doing your own thing and learning it by trial and error?
Well, prior to recording that song with Dionne, as I said, became my first kind of hit. I hadn't spent any time in a major recording studio. And now that you mention it, that's the first time I realized that was my first time in a real recording studio. Before that, I had only spent time with another mentor of mine, a guy named Victor Reed in Atlanta.
Wait a minute, Ben. I thought you said that when you came and recorded with me here in Nashville, that was the first time you ever in a real studio.
Well, yeah, that was my way of ingratiating myself with you. It was a complete lie.
Nice, man. All right, cool. Well, I like that story. I'm fascinated by Atlanta. I didn't even knew it was a music scene really until I was living in Nashville and I began to become aware that there was it was sort of a hip hop central. Atlanta is our middle coast for hip hop, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say so. And other scenes that have tried to jump off in Atlanta, but the roots of the scene go all the way back to obviously slavery, where people had the opportunity to emerge from slavery and either go up north or stay around in Georgia. And many of them stayed around in Georgia and spread out to like Macon and Augusta, which gave birth to James Brown,
That's right.
Little Richard, Ray Charles, So It's kind of crazy.
Well, that's pretty wild. Well, all right. So then you ended up out in LA after working with Dionne and having these opportunities come along?
Yeah. It took about nearly 20 years before I made that move. I mean, in that time, I also got a record deal myself to record. And so right after my second record on Capitol, then I moved to Los Angeles.
Nice, man. Well, I think we got a lot to talk about because I love the sound of your records.
Thank you.
You shared a lot of great YouTube clips with me that I'm going to put in the show notes, Rockstar, so you can check it out. But Van, you've got a really unique and distinct sound that like clearly to me appreciates the beauty of a 4-track. Like you dig lo-fi, you know what I mean? In the right kind of way. I mean, if I had to pick one word to describe your recordings, I would just say dark.
Yeah.
And it's cool though. It's like, that's one of the things that I really love about well-produced stuff like that. When your recordings can sound so dark and mysterious, the sounds, yet powerful at the same time and compelling, that you've really got something good going. Do you want to talk a little bit about how important it is to you that there's mystery in what you're recording?
Well, I'd love to. And one of the things I like about, what you say in your mission statement about the podcast is that you're there to talk about how to make recordings, which is probably one of my favorite conversations.
Because good place for it.
Yeah. In terms of how I record and what I'm looking for, I don't even know how much of it is me trying to be mysterious or even to sound dark or anything. All of those things could be fed by my environment or my upbringing, I'm sure, and the music that I listen to that I'm influenced by. But in terms of tape itself, 4-track especially, what I like about that is it draws a line around the possibilities. And let's just assume for a moment that anything is possible. I actually believe that, but let's just say anything is possible. Now, you can't take anything and sell it. You have to bring something into focus and sell that so that people can begin to understand, what you're about. And the 4-track just does that automatically without even laying a note down. You have 4 tracks to try and create something and bring something into focus out of this kind of, infinite possibility, So that's what I immediately starting out. That's what I like about 4 tracks.
Yeah.
And of course you can take it and you can multiply it and overdub, and go from there. But, I like starting like that as my starting point.
I agree with you. I've sort of discovered that through my creative career too, that art is created by pushing against limitations. It's like you have to have boundaries to push against to be able to express yourself in art, I think.
Yeah. And, obviously you could extend that to the larger society as well as a philosophy and even dealing with other people and other ecosystems and on and on. Yeah. But to start, to say with music, you really do have you could start with anything. Like I could make a beat on a tree, and start humming along and chanting and, and then put that with a drum machine or put that with an orchestra. And suddenly I've bridged several continents, with a sound.
Well, that's true. That's actually a big popular African instrument is the log drum. It's just basically a carved out tree that you sit on and beat the crap out of. It's a great sound too. Well, cool. So I love the 4 tracks, but there's also a sonic thing that happens on a 4-track where it sort of limits the frequency response and the dynamic response of the instrument that you're recording and gives it a focus and a tone, Can you talk a little bit about what that means and how that works with some of the stuff you've recorded?
Yeah, I had to actually come to understand what you just said from working with other engineers, and one of which is my usual recording engineer for my own records, Melissa Matty, who lives in Nashville. But she actually explained to me through complaining that the sound that I was coming up with was affected by the lack of frequency response in the 4-track, which drove her crazy, of course, because I'm handing her 4-track material to turn into something that will compete with Jay-Z or Rihanna. And so, but for my ears, I needed that kind of limitation to set an obstacle for myself and a goal for myself. And the fact that when I'm listening to, Jimi Hendrix's Electric Ladyland, the fact that it is also limited by a certain kind of standard of quality may actually have influenced me, but it's what he does within that limitation. There is nothing that sounds like Electric Ladyland. And if Jimmy were alive today, I'd love to have asked him, like, what was his favorite song. I guarantee you he says When Cries Mary or Electric Ladyland, because he was able to bring everything that he is about, at least from what I've read, everything that he's about, he put into those 2 recordings, from the way he likes to play, but also the way he orchestrates sound, the way he likes to write lyrics, the way he even likes his voice to sound. All of those elements are in those 2 songs specifically. And I think that the fact that I was able to hear that and get that is probably what led to, wanting to start with the 4-track and the place where I can say, okay, I'm going to start right there, but I'm going to bring everything I'm about and smash it into this one place.
Yeah.
And then let it bridge out from there.
Well, now I've worked with you. You and I had a wonderful session with Blessing Offer, which was a blast. Blessing's a whole nother fantastic guy. He's been on the podcast as well.
Cool.
And I know that you work with Logic also. You're totally comfortable inside a computer. And most of our listeners probably don't have a 4-track or even access to a traditional cassette one. Talk about the difference between computer and 4-track, or how do you manage to still find the focus and figure out what you want to do when you're inside a computer, which is sort of, in some ways, like infinitely open-ended.
Yeah, it is. And, it wasn't really until I sat down with a Logic Pro expert who essentially gave me a paid tutorial that I understood the possibilities in Logic, because it was just this big, scary world for somebody who's just coming from doing demos on 4-track. Yeah. And forgotten in there is the fact that I did at one point move to 8-track reel-to-reel. Anyway, so I go into Logic. The first thing he tells me is anything you want to do, you can do. He said, that's not the number one thing to remember.
And you're like, but I don't want to do anything. What are you talking about?
Well, he said that, and to put it in context, he said that because I was asking him some questions that he probably found strange, because I'm asking him as someone who's only worked with tape, and I don't know that this guy, he was younger than me. I don't know that he'd ever even worked with tape. So, but he did want me to know that, that there have been so many amendments to this thing that we call software, DAW.
No, he knew about tape, man, because they have those nice T-shirts at Target with a cassette printed on them.
Yeah, exactly. But he was like, anything you want to do, I promise you can do. And you can do it probably in several different ways. And then he went through and showed me, how he could answer some of my questions and the different ways that he could answer it. So that was the first time I said, oh, okay, so I can approach this open-ended set of possibilities by drawing a kind of standard for myself. Like, these are the limitations I want. Now, how can I break those rules on those limitations? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. If you were to walk into any big corporation today, if they had a meeting on creativity or breaking new records. That's what they would do. They would set up this set of limitations, and they'd say, now you guys tell me how to think outside this box.
Have you seen a picture of me lately? You know, if I walk into any corporation, they usually usher me back out the front door.
No, they probably do that or think you were the owner.
They might even give me $1 and sort of say, here, there's a lunch place down the street.
But that's how I approach the whole DAW. And yes, I go through and call it all the letters.
Yeah, right. I go back and forth on that. DAW, whatever you want. Well, it's sort of funny. You talk about being able to do anything. And my reaction is, I don't want to do anything. I just want to do the right thing.
Yeah. And I do understand that. But, there are a lot of wrong things inside of a Captain Beefheart record.
God, let's talk about Captain Beefheart. I love Don Von
It sounds like something so right.
Yes. So I think we were talking about that when you were here, that I had heard this story about Captain Beefheart telling his guitar player, who I apologize, I've forgotten his name, but advising him as he was forming his band that he needed to just go sit in front of a tree and play to a tree all day long for practice. Like that was his advice to get better for the band. Which actually telling it, like the first time I told it sounded kooky. Now I'm like, yeah, of course. Why wouldn't you go take a guitar out and play sitting and looking at a tree, But, Captain Beefheart's band, they just had this incredible sound, especially some of the earlier stuff. Actually, I don't think he made a record I didn't like, but there were a couple of early ones, Trout Mask Replica and that whole, what followed that. What was it? Sure. I can't remember one with the two fruit bats in a food fight or whatever.
Please don't ask me because I do not break down their records.
They're so good. They're like so good. But Rockstar's Captain Beefheart would sort of create music that in some ways was familiar. In other ways, it broke all the rules about the way music was meant to be played and what the beats were and what instruments and all that. But also his lyrics are just incredible. It's like this, it's Tom Waits before Tom Waits figured it out,
Right, exactly. And I just love that, he had this set of limitations, you know what I mean? He had the major music system that not only was he battling against, but his good friend Frank Zappa was too, and battling in such a creative way. So he was like, well, I'm just going to take even more and throw it inside of these rules and try and break down the rules. And, of course, that's how people come up with cliches, because those cliches are largely true. Rules are made to be broken. Mm-hmm. But you have to set those rules. They're just as important as the creativity that breaks them, True.
Yeah. Well, so let me jump in. I've got a whole list of questions thought I'd ask you, and some of them might feel like a non sequitur, but I think they'll probably all be good. I'll just jump in and we'll just keep flowing with this as we go.
Sure.
I know you'd come from sort of a lot of background with programmed drums and hip hop beats and things like that. And listening to your songs, I can't always tell if it was, what was performed and what was looped. But there's always a pocket and there's a groove and there's something that's really right about each one. Share a story about the importance of groove and pocket to you. And then I've got sort of a Shakespearean question for you, which is to quantize or not to quantize.
This is good, man. This is good. You got to have me back. Or what? Somebody needs to do an interview with you. I'm sure you've done that.
I've just got questions, man. I got no answers.
That should be your new mantra. I love the question because rhythm is certainly important to me. I'm going to start out my answer by saying that I don't think having the perfect rhythmic track is the secret to having a great song. Because, the thing about rhythm is that, again, you're just bringing something into focus that already exists. It's already there. And I know it's kind of hard for some people to conceptualize this, but when you approach, creating a song, like most of those elements are there. It's just something that you're pulling out, even whether it's melody, it's chords, or rhythm, because music is no different than any other kind of discipline. It's like science, trying to make the world make sense to you.
Yeah,
So
you mean if
you're
you've got the
using,
song, you're sort of pulling out melodic elements, or you're pulling out chordal elements, or you're pulling out rhythmic beats.
yeah, or if you even if you just have the notion, an idea, to create a song, like you begin pulling things together. You're like, oh, I came up with this melody in the shower. You know what I mean? That melody also had all kinds of chords and rhythms along with it. You just didn't necessarily pull that out. You focused on what the melody was.
Yeah.
This is the way it happens, and you don't have to take my word for it. But I know I know it as fact because I've really thought long and hard about this and done a lot of research into creativity and how it works. And I know that it works kind of like a complex system, but you're pulling these melodies, these chords, these rhythms out of the ether, and you begin focusing on it.
Yeah.
And the rhythm, I like to start a song rhythmically because that's just how I was taught, is how establishing a rhythmic bed that is without chord, bass note, melody. It's just rhythm, sheer rhythm, and almost like listening to African drums or an African drum troupe. And I start there, even though I may have a song already in mind. I start there, and once that sounds like a song to me, like it's something that I wouldn't mind releasing out to the world as my song, just the drums, then and only then do I begin putting other things on it.
Cool.
And so, of course, I can go with the melody, I could go with the bass line, I could go with the guitar part, I can go any direction. But I know that foundation is as solid as it would be if I were, building a house.
Well, let's back up for a sec and let's talk about some of the various ways that you have begun your songs with the drum foundation. Whether it was playing pads on some kind of controller, or whether it was playing a drum kit. Just share with us a story about one of the cool ways that you started a song and it began with the drums.
Well, it's really odd to me because a lot of the DJs now, you'll go into or you'll see a show on YouTube or something, and there's a DJ, he's doing a live show, and everything he's doing is live. But rarely does it actually sound like a drummer approaches drums. So it's always weird to me when people are saying they're going to these live like DJ shows, because even though somebody programs a drum machine live, their whole drive is to try and make it not sound live, which is strange to me. But when you get into hip hop, you start with someone who is trying to imitate, whether they realize it or not, they're trying to imitate James Brown. Obviously, James Brown has a bunch of great drummers. So, but if you go to a 90s hip hop producer like that, he'll always refer you right back to James Brown. That's what he was trying to go for.
Yeah.
And the best James Brown songs are the guys who lock in, and it sounds like almost like a drum machine. And the drum machine is kind of morphed from that place. And when I'm programming drums, I'm immediately thinking about how to get that kick to where it doesn't sound, flabby. It's hard, and it's something that's poking out at me and makes me move from my midsection down. You know what I mean? And then I want a snare that's snapping, and it doesn't have a bunch of decay on it. I want something that's snappy right in my face. Obviously, later on, you can add decay, just the same way my man who recorded Led Zeppelin, John Bonham, where he brought ambience to the drum sound by recording them in a particular kind of environment. But the drum itself, if you were to sit in front of John Bonham's drums, you wouldn't be able to tell that from something that was just as tight out in the African field or James Brown. Just take my word for it. They bring in the ambience and add to that.
Yeah.
And similarly with James Brown versus a Philadelphia International soul record or Patsy Cline. I mean, listen to some of those old country records. Those drums are very, very tight, beautiful sounding.
Yep.
And so they start there. It's a good, solid sound. You sit in front of that drum set, or you sit in front of the speakers with your drum machine, and it needs to be a nice, solid sound that moves you. And then you go from there. I want to add some delay. I want to add some verb to it or whatever. And it starts to give it a different kind of personality.
Now, you've made a lot of records already, so you have a vision for what you might want to add to it to give it that different personality. But I imagine initially you just had to stumble on and experiment with things. So you had to accidentally put delay on it one day and reverb and go, oh man, that sounds cool, and mess around with it. Talk a little bit about that process of leaving room for experimentation so that you keep rediscovering new avenues you didn't know existed.
Well, unfortunately, one of the things that I learned early on, I learned this from Randy Jackson, is that there's always room for experimentation, even past the point of ruining your song. Yeah. So he's had to pull me back a couple of times and say, man, I think we've added a bit too much, on this track. So, but, I do try and leave myself open, through listening to other people, program drums or even play drums and how they play them and the things they're looking for. Or of course, listening to the radio, playing all kinds of songs. I mean, I can't even tell you how much money I've spent, probably much like many of your listeners, on just other people's music and listening over and over and over again, trying to find inspiration. Yeah. And, and then, of course, it's so much fun to just sit with a new machine and try different things and learning through making, I guess, what other people might call mistakes.
Well, now, if you're programming a beat in Logic, do you like to, how do you do that? I mean, like, what controller would you plug into Logic typically to program a beat? How would you even begin that process?
Well, I'll use anything that's handy. As you saw when we came to your studio, it didn't matter to me. You picked up this little bitty
what was it, the Axiom keyboard or something like that?
I had never even used that before. In fact, you had to teach me how to plug it up to my computer. But it's like handing somebody a guitar. Like, it isn't about the guitar. It's about the ideas that are in your head. It's about those fingers that you're using and all the experience you bring into it. That's what it's about. And it determines whether you're going to get something that's worth a shit, or not. And that's what it is when you're, approaching programming the drums. It doesn't matter about the controller. The controller might impact how you approach programming the drums, whether the keys are heavy or they're light, whether or not they're even keys at all, whether they're pads, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It creates it does influence how you make the sound. And you can, set up those limitations for yourself and say, I'm only going to program drums on a keyboard controller, or I'm only going to program drums on a pad controller. I don't do that. I'm not a reductionist, but I know people who do.
Now, we still haven't answered that question, though, but we're up against it again. To quantize or not to quantize?
I think it really depends on the sound you're going for. Me personally, I experiment with quantizing different things, different elements. Like the beat I made last night, the kick drum, I quantized. The snare drum, I pushed back, I delayed it. And the hi-hat, it was just all recorded linearly with no quantize. So, no quantization, I should say. And so the beat is kind of what I like. That's what gave me the sense that it was something that was alive and yet moving together. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's almost like the kick is the foundation, and if you got a strong foundation, you can always build a. I was going to say you can always get away with building a wobbly first floor, and it's still cool.
Well, what I'd like to look at it as is that the whole system, like the kick, the snare, and the hat, are a system, and so I'm trying to, and all of those are parts. And obviously, a system is not the sum of its parts; it's the parts and their interaction. Yeah. And then you're talking about a system that kind of works for everybody. But, of course, sometimes you're like, oh, that hi-hat isn't really moving the way I like it to. And then you'll spend 3 days working on a hi-hat track that doesn't really fix the overall. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so what I like to do is, think about all those parts as I'm laying one part or working on one part, so that I don't get so fixated on this one little thing. And what that allows me to do is to be able to do like we did with the Blessing, 7 tunes right off the bat, with, musicians coming in and songs that I hadn't really even worked on before. And, he winds up, with most of his record done in a week.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, one thing, I mean, not to go too deep into that particular experience, but something I noticed you doing was you weren't afraid to approach the song one way and then pull it right back again and rethink it and maybe use bits and pieces and start approaching it this direction now,
Yeah. And I think that in that situation, I was looked at as the leader. And so when we brought in the musicians, it was a matter of leading from the back. Those musicians probably weren't even aware that I was the leader of the session. They just played and gave their feedback, gave their suggestions, and, boom, then they were done. And so then the focal point, I come even more so into the focal point as the leader. So then I have to take sort of a more aggressive stance on how to put the session together. So then I begin doing my thing, which is the kind of programming, playing a few keyboards, assembling parts. And then I take a step back to allow Blessing then to come, or the lead singer, to come and put their face on their own project, which I think is really, really important. And so as a leader, you can lead from anywhere in the room. Because, ultimately it's about an egoless kind of endeavor to get this whole system working for someone whose face is on the product.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, that actually brings us to a question I was going to ask you when I was listening to a bunch of your records and this unique style and the program beat and sort of the dark tonalities and stuff like that, and leaving room for your voice to sit on top. It's almost like your voice had more of the higher frequencies and there was space for it because of the way you treated the instruments and stuff. So my question was going to be, can you produce a track the same way for another singer as you would produce it for yourself, which is what you're getting into the answer for. But do you want to comment more on that? Like, what's the difference of producing a track for yourself, and what do you discover are things that don't always work when you produce it for somebody else and you have to reconfigure?
Well, most of my success comes with producing other people. And I shouldn't say producing because that's kind of a weird word for me. A lot of times when I'm working with people, the public doesn't even know, because my role is really more of that of an artist development, if you will. Mm-hmm. I love guiding people with their own sound to the market. And that's what I'm doing when I'm so-called producing or in the studio with other artists. And it's much easier than working with myself because, you find all kinds of things get in the way when you're trying to make your own music, particularly the kind of way people distort the information that is in your head versus what comes out of your mouth. There's a lot of time in there for your ego to kind of distort that information, and it becomes a little weird. And so in terms of communicating and articulating a point, it's much easier for me to help someone else to get that out of themselves and bring it to market than it is for me to do it myself. And in fact, a lot of people don't believe this when I say it, but I, as an artist, would prefer to work with a producer who can help me with that than producing myself.
I have seen the value of having a great producer work with somebody, and I have not had a chance to work. Well, I mean, here and there, but I've never really made my own music or music with my band where somebody else was producing. And I think I would love that experience, especially if it's somebody that I really trusted.
Right.
And I think that's got to be the key, right? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the value of having a trusting relationship between a producer and the artist that's making the record. And what's the point? Why does an artist want to have a producer?
Well, I think that an artist would want to have a producer because with the best circumstances, that's going to give you the greater result that satisfies your needs as well as the needs of the system you put in place. And even mentioning the word system brings me back to the whole idea of what this is about. Let's take Motown, for instance. There was a system there that started an idea. So some guy comes off the street and says, I have this song about comparing symphony to love. And then he's like, somebody else says, oh, I have a symphony. Love is a symphony. And they start throwing around ideas. Those two become the songwriters. And then some other guy comes up. He knows how to put chords together. And they're like, oh, can you put chords to this melody? Boom. Now you have kind of a almost complete song. It has a little piano, a little bit of a lyric, and a little bit of a melody. Then an arranger comes in and he's like, well, shoot, I can put some strings to this. Let me call up the band and maybe they can, put a backing track on this. And all of a sudden you're in the studio with a drummer, bassist, keyboardist, guitarist, and you got an entire system putting together what started out as some idea that some dude walked in off the street with. And then after you finish that, you put on the strings, you put on the background vocals. It goes upstairs, and Barry Gordy's sitting up there as the president of the label, and he's got 5, 6, 7 people who are now charged with how to take this product and play it and sell it to people who've never heard it and have shown no desire to have it.
Now, hold up. I got to interject one anecdote that I heard about Barry Gordy, too. I remember hearing this great story that he had a group of like 10 people that were trusted ears or something like that, so that when he would have what he thought was a hit, he'd run it past those 10 people first. And if it made it through all 10 people, then he knew he had a hit. And I love that story, right?
Exactly. And it all came out of this one little small house, but it was the might that was in the system itself. And that's why an artist wants a producer, because a producer can communicate what's inside of your head to that larger system. And if that system is put together and with a particular goal in mind, which would be meeting the marketplace, it can help you with that original idea that you had in your head to articulate it to an audience that's going to then support, your idea. Obviously, in our society, that support has to come in the form of a currency that builds the economy.
Wait a minute, YouTube likes?
Yeah. No, less so that. It's still about money, unfortunately. But I think we are moving towards something that might, require less money, but we're not there yet. And so, unfortunately, now you still have to get people to go into their pocket, pull out some money to support your idea. And it still requires a team that you assemble, a system that you assemble that can take your idea and help you articulate it and communicate it to the larger market.
That's deep, man. You've been thinking about this before.
Yeah.
This isn't the first time you thought about this.
I've lived it.
It's cool, man. I mean, I think if you had asked me the same question, I would have had a different answer, but they might have been the same in the end. I appreciate your way of having a very wide open answer. This sort of anybody who's listening to this can begin to see a correlation in what they do and how this could work. Because we all have different systems in a way,
Sure.
You talk about a system. I think about, you're talking about Motown, and I've always loved that. I've always thought, man, that's so cool that they just had this, they bring these people together and same people are playing music together and making music together every day. And that system created all this amazing stuff. And it's one of the things that I really appreciate about what I've had an opportunity here to do with my studio, and having some great engineers and interns around and great musicians and stuff, is I begin to get a feel for a system. And the more we create our own system, the more it works for us. And Rockstars, I encourage you to apply that to your own situation too. Like, believe in your system, believe in the people you're working with, because whatever it is that you are thinking of right now while you're listening to this, it's probably totally doable. And you're probably already doing it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great way of putting it.
Well, so now when you talk about the producer and the system, there's a certain responsibility of being able to identify when the song is done, when the production is done, and it's time to go to the next step. How do you know that you've got it right in the studio and that you're done?
Well, I think that a good way is looking around the room, and if it's warm in there, I learned this from Quincy Jones. If the heads are bobbing and it's warm in the room, that's when you cut it off. You're like, this is it. Bounce it, Lige. You know what I mean?
Nice.
That's what I try and do, man. because there's no reason in the world to go changing something that people are already feeling.
Yeah, that's good advice. That's a big thing too when it comes to trying to capture the take on something.
Exactly.
I struggle with this a lot where there's a vocal take you're doing or there's a band performance and something happens. Somebody performs something and you feel it when you're listening. And then you have to ask yourself this question. You say, all right, I was feeling that. That was great. Is that a sign that we're done or should we do one more? And then if we do one more, do I have to then go back and try and re-feel what I felt between listening to both those takes and decide if one's better than the other? And where does that leave us? So what does that mean? I mean, like, is the most important thing to do to be able to identify your experience listening to something? Or like you said, the other people in the room, and then just say, this is it. We just hit it. We just hit that threshold. There's no reason to keep going because we leave it behind if we keep moving.
Well, obviously, there are times when you have something in your head that you're trying to achieve. And even if other people are feeling what you've produced thus far, it may fall short of what you had in your head. But in that case, I would say capture what you have that people are feeling and then continue, along a continued route to achieve what it is you were going for initially. But don't erase or dismiss that thing that everybody in the room is feeling. That's sort of what people call a magical moment.
Yeah. And
you want to keep that. Also, I don't want to stop anybody from trying to get what's in their head. I have no idea what's in there. It could be something even better. So by all means, go and get it. But let's not cost more money than we need to. But with you trying to achieve it, particularly when we have something that people are feeling.
Yeah. Well, there's a term for what we do. We're in the studio capturing music and making records. And it's all right there in that word, record. You want a record of that moment. And if you forget that moment because you kept moving and you forgot it and you couldn't go back and find it later, you didn't really get a good record of it. So
Exactly.
So I guess that's part of it. But it also reminds me of something else that I saw you do. And first of all, I've been making records for 25 years, and I love the fact that you and I had a chance to work together this past year, and we never worked together before. And already I learned something new just from that experience with you. That's a real blessing. No pun intended, because we were working on Blessing's record. But that's a real blessing for what we do, is that there's always this opportunity to keep learning, and keep discovering whole new epiphanies about music and record making through the people that we work with. But what you did is there was this moment on a song where you were out there singing on the mic, and we listened in here, and you did this one thing. This one little vocal twist off the back end of a chorus lyric, and it sounded really cool. And then you were like, yeah, what'd you guys think? Were you hearing anything? And typical control room response, like, oh yeah, man, yeah, it was real good, dude. It was cool. Well, there was this one moment in there, and you were just like, great, take me to that moment. So we went and we played you that one little spot. And I guess luckily I was smart enough to record that moment by writing it down as it went by, so I could remember where to find it. And then you heard it, and then you said, well, let's double it. So we put in another track, you doubled it, and it sounded super cool. And you came in and heard it, and you're like, great, throw away the rest of it, So we ended up using this cool sound that happened one time in the song out of nowhere. And it was super cool. And I appreciated that about your approach to music, is you're like, no, that bit's good. There's no reason why we have to worry about the rest of the song. We don't have to go figure out now how this bit lives in 10,000 other places throughout the rest of the song where it's not needed,
Yeah, totally. And I think that does come from my 4-track mentality. I want to use what works. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I want to put it together with something else that works. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time trying to satisfy my ego. And I do have one, like everybody else does. And I think that as a producer, it's really important that you can get people to work beyond their egos. And most people imagine that what they want is the most important thing that's going on in the world right now.
Right.
And actually, it is the least important, even though it is important. It is definitely not as important as satisfying the system that we have working together, because now we've enlisted all kinds of people in this to help us get our idea across. And once you start that process, you have to listen to where it's going, because it will guide you to something that you hadn't imagined before. Not your narcissism, not your ego, none of those people had imagined before, but the people you've enlisted to help you with that idea. This is something that none of you individually would have come up with. And it's very important to pay attention to that, because you can always make music by yourself.
It's cool, man. Do you think you were meant to be a scientist too? I mean, was that like your other calling? Were you supposed to be in some secret science lab developing, new alien technologies? I like your discussion of systems and stuff. It's really wild.
Well, it has taught me a lot. I mean, studying up on complex systems, and I did make the immediate correlation between that and trying to make music.
Yeah. I know you, man. On all your lunch breaks, you're watching TED Talk videos, aren't you?
No, those things drive me crazy.
I actually used to love doing that. I just outed myself. That's exactly what I would do. Is I would take a lunch break and I'd watch an 18-minute TED Talk video on some totally amazing string theory discussion. And I was like, this is perfect. It's like 18 minutes long. That's how long it takes me to eat a bowl of reheated leftovers.
TED Talks. Those are great, though. I really like the ufology videos, man. People are like, oh, I got a picture of an alien spacecraft. And it's like this picture of this guy's light in his backyard.
It's like a pewter saucer that somebody threw through the yard.
And everybody's arguing about it, Yeah.
All right, so I'm looking at some of my questions here, and most of them you've answered them. How do you know that you're starting the session with the right songs?
Ooh, it depends on the artist that you're working with. Someone like we might as well mention Blessing again, since that was the time that brought us together. But Blessing is a songwriter primarily, and so once I recognized that as his most obvious strength, then I knew that I could take, the songs that he's written. Nearly all of them are very solid as songs, in that there's a melody that resonates, and there's some kind of chordal support that is there that helps the melody. And so you can take almost any song and build something around it. And from there, I was able to just take the ones that kind of resonated with me personally the most, and then the ones that he really, really loved, and the ones that his management really, really loved. And then I kind of picked from those tunes, or we all did actually, and we started from there. Now,
you're already describing the system, right? It's you, it's the artist, it's the management.
Exactly. Obviously, as that moved on, there were times when I had to be more of the leader in deciding, which song was working and which one wasn't. But that was how we started out.
Nice. All right. So that's at the beginning of a process. And now let's zip forward to the end of making a record. And you kind of answered this again with your, talking about the heads bobbing in the room. But give us another tip on how to avoid overproducing a song.
Man, that is very difficult to prescribe. But is it okay to overproduce a song? Yes, especially if you are okay with someone nudging you about overproducing, right? So, for instance, when you and I were working together, and there were moments when I'm in the studio with headphones on, and I have a guitar, and I'm playing, and obviously I'm feeling what I'm playing, but it may not be working for the song, and so you might have to say, as the engineer, who's now kind of the leader of the session, saying, because the producer's playing guitar, and you say, hey man, that thing right there is cool, but it's kind of out of tune, or that thing right there is cool, but I don't know what it's doing for the song. Then I have to put back on my producer hat and come in and listen and say to myself, okay, I'm sitting over this whole system that's putting this song together. Now, is this working for everybody and all our goals? Maybe not.
Yeah.
And that would be the time to kind of shut it down and, set the ego aside for a moment. There is a bit of healthy ego that can help you come up with a great guitar part.
Oh, good God, you need ego. Are you kidding? To make a record in the first place, we got to have a ton of ego to even attempt this crap. Why else would you get on stage and make people listen to you?
Exactly. Or get mad at your parents. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. The heart of rock and roll. So, but that is like the key. And that's something I was thinking about when I was asking about the value of a producer too. It's the trusted ears thing. It's the fact that you can't be in two places at once. You can't be zoomed all the way in, editing a drum sound, and zoomed all the way out, listening to the overall groove and the whole song arrangement at the same time. You can't be playing guitar in the other room with headphones on and in the control room listening to how it all adds up on speakers at the same time. And that's why it's so valuable to have collaboration with other people and trust built up, where you can be like, all right, I'm going to stand over on this side of the holler and you stand on that side of the holler. And I'll trust you if you say that everything's cool over there. And you trust me if I say everything's cool over here. And together we'll I don't really know what the holler reference was. That was another Tennessee thing, I think, maybe.
The Butcher Holler, though? That's cool.
But there they go. So I think that's cool. And I mean, what about this? When you've done enough records that you've been in environments where you didn't have trust right off the bat, what advice do you have for people to skip a long waiting period and build trust quickly with the people so you can get down to work and really do the best you can with this group of people in this system?
You asking how do you establish trust?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm just saying you're good at it and you've probably worked with a lot of people that you can trust, but there got to be some times where you feel like it's tough to build that rapport. And so what have you learned about sort of more quickly getting to a place of trust so that the session doesn't just, slow to a crawl?
Well, what I find is like what I mentioned to you about when you're bringing in a lot of really, really good, experienced musicians to work on your record. I find that it's good to allow them, because a lot of them are going to come in with their own kind of confidence. And it's good to allow them to feel like they're driving the car, even though they're not. But It's good to make them feel like they are, so that they can give their ideas however, in whatever comfortable way allows them to give their best ideas. And then, of course, you can always remind someone that you're in charge. That's the easiest thing in the world, because you've actually been paid to do this. So, hitting somebody over the head with the fact that you're the producer is unimportant. Right. It's only important to you and your ego. But getting really good ideas from someone, you do need to establish some kind of comfort for them in order to do that. So if they feel like they need to be in charge, let them feel like they're in charge, and get their ideas from them and put it into this thing that's a very special thing that you're trying to put together with other people. And it takes a little bit of that.
I would say that back to you in that, even if you're working with people that you just totally don't get and you don't think they get you still, that's who you got to work with right now. And you still want their very best so that you can pick and choose what's going to work for this record. And the way that those people are going to give you their very best is by allowing themselves to feel a little bit vulnerable, right? Which requires an element of trust.
Absolutely. So and if you meet them, if you meet them where they are emotionally, and even if it's artificial, even if they just feel like you're trying to meet them where they are emotionally, they can begin to say, okay, this guy's all right. I trust him. And, as you said, they'll give something close to their very best. It'll definitely be something you wouldn't have come up with on your own.
Nice. Hey, rock stars, we're actually going to wrap up now and kind of skip the jam session today because we got into so many great topics with Van already and answered so many fantastic questions. Rock stars, I want to remind you that you can find links to all the things we're talking about in the show notes, which are either right on your mobile device. If you're just in the podcast player, you can usually see them there. You can just click through with your finger, or you can go to rsrockstars.com and then just search for Van Hunt, VanHunt, and it'll take you right to the blog post. And if you enjoyed the music that we were talking about in the beginning of the podcast, you're welcome to go check that out at skadooshmusic.com, SKADOOSH music.com. Van, I want to thank you very much for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars. It's a blast working with you in the studio, and it's a blast having you on the show. Let our listeners know how they can find you online, learn more about you, reach out to you, make their next best record with you, whatever you want.
Well, I'm available at any time. All you have to do is close your eyes and smell the smoke signal. I'm the spirit in the air. No, I'm at vanhunt.com, and that's the best way to find me. And you can find me on Twitter, also at Van Hunt, and somehow on Facebook, which I don't really know how to contact me on Facebook. Nice.
Well, Rockstars, like I said, we'll have links in the show notes. If you're on your mobile device, you can just click through with your finger, find the show notes there, and I'm going to have links to Van's YouTube videos, and you can go check out all his great music and songs. Thanks so much for joining us on the show again, man. It's been a pleasure hanging out with you.
Dude, thank you. And being able to just talk about recording, that's awesome. It's a dream gig. Thank you.
I love hearing your philosophies on all this stuff. It's just great stuff.
I appreciate that, man.
We'll see you around the studio, dude. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right, man. Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lij Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.